Snow came down in slow, colorless flakes, vanishing as they touched the churned mud of the Hürtgen forest. Among the stunted pines and splintered trunks, men in faded field gray moved like shadows, silent, hollow-eyed, weapons slung across shoulders because their arms were too heavy to hold them ready anymore. It was late 1944, though few could say what day. Weeks and months had blurred into one long, wet night. Shells came in fits, never enough to kill everyone, but always enough to keep nerves frayed to threads. The forest smelled of smoke and rot, and the faint sour tang of unwashed wool. Somewhere, a shovel scraped at a dugout wall, then stopped. No one had the energy for conversation. They called themselves Frontschwein, front pigs. It was a bitter joke, a word that carried the weight of everything they had become. Men rooted to a line that never truly moved, whose lives were measured by incoming artillery and supply shortages. A boy from Hamburg, his hands split and raw from cold, sat hunched over a small tin of ersatz coffee, eyes fixed on nothing. He had been here since '42, fighting first in Russia, then pulled back west when the Eastern Front collapsed into retreat. Others beside him had once believed in the triumphs of early victories. Now they were thin, haunted, their boots leaking, their greatcoats patched with whatever scraps could be found. The forest itself seemed built to kill them slowly. Low clouds smothered the sky so thoroughly that even midday felt like dusk. Shellfire tore gaps in the trees, leaving jagged stumps that pointed upward like warning fingers. Rainwater gathered in trenches and froze overnight into jagged plates of ice. Men slipped and cursed softly, or sometimes didn't curse at all. The silence of exhaustion was heavier than anger. They lived inside it. Officially, units rotated, on paper. In truth, entire divisions had been bled and patched and bled again. There were no fresh replacements left to cycle in, only boys pulled from classrooms and men dragged from factories. Each new face that arrived was pale and underfed, shivering even before the cold reached them. They were shown a section of trench, handed a rifle older than they were, and told to hold. It had not always felt endless. In 1940, there had been songs and flags. France fell in weeks, the enemy broken before it could strike back. Then Russia, vast but conquerable, or so they thought. But now, for years later, they were cornered in a haunted forest along the western border, tried to stop an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. Allied artillery reached deep, shaking dugouts and sending loose soil down onto damp blankets. Night brought the low hum of enemy aircraft. Day brought the slow mechanical groan of tanks, shifting far behind the trees. A runner stumbled into the dugout, dropping a satchel of stale bread and a handful of letters. The men did not leap for them. Most knew the contents already. Grim words from home about bombings, hunger. Cities turned to rubble. Mothers asked when they would come home. None of them could answer. The Reich had no return plan for its soldiers. There was no leave, no reprieve. You fought until you were dead, captured, or too shattered to hold a rifle. Even then, they might send you back with a patched uniform and a few bandages. One man, gray stubble along his jaw, reached into his tunic and drew out a photograph. Wife, 2 small children, a house that might already be ash. He stared for a long time, then tucked it away without expression. Nearby, another shifted, coughing dryly into his sleeve. They did not speak of going home. Home was a concept that had quietly left the trenches months ago. What made the weight heavier was the dawning sense that the enemy lived by different rules. Prisoners returned from American hands told strange tales of warm camps, cigarettes, real bread. Some whispered of Allied troops getting rest breaks, of soldiers fighting only months before being sent away to safety. The stories sounded like fantasies. Cruel rumors meant to break morale. Yet something about them lingered like smoke after shelling. If the enemy could leave the front alive, if somewhere across the lines men were fighting, and then going back to warm beds and whole cities, what did that mean for those chained here without end? Another shell landed somewhere beyond the tree line, sending a thump through the frozen ground. No one flinched. The men were past that. They adjusted scarves and shifted numb feet in waterlogged boots. A thin curtain of fog clung to the earth, blurring the ruined forest into shapes half real. Somewhere far above, beyond the reach of their world, plans were being made in offices with maps and warm stoves. Down here, There was only the slow grind of survival and the heavy knowledge that for the Frontschwein, there was no timetable but death or defeat. The forest would keep them until it no longer needed them, and no one back home would be counting the days. The rumor arrived the way most things did in the front. Slipped in with the cold, quiet and uninvited. At first it came as a careless remark from a man who had spent a week in a field hospital and been brought back patched but trembling. He said an American prisoner had told him something strange, that across the line, soldiers fought for a time and then went home. Not back behind their own front to rest for a day or two, but home, across the ocean, back to their families and warm kitchens. The statement drew no laughter first, only a dull silence and a few blank stares. Then, as if to push back the absurdity, the trench erupted with short, bitter chuckles. Someone spat into mud and muttered that Americans were liars, and that prisoners would say anything to weaken a man's spirit. Another man shook his head, calling it an obvious trick. Yet the idea would not go away. Once a thought like that slips into a place of endless waiting, it takes root. At night, when artillery went quiet long enough for sleep to creep in, minds turned it over like a small, smooth stone. What if there were armies that measured service in months instead of years? What if war for someone was something you could step out of and survive? The next thread came from an unexpected place. A patrol had taken casualties but returned with 2 American prisoners, mud-caked, exhausted, but strangely unbroken. One, barely more than a boy with freckles and a torn sleeve, spoke halting German picked up from somewhere. He asked for cigarettes, smiled nervously, and when someone asked how long he had been here, he shrugged and said 9 months. 9 months? The veterans blinked. One of them had been away from home for 5 years. They pressed him. After 9 months, what happens? The boy shrugged again and said something about points, about going home once you'd done enough time or seen enough combat. The guards laughed then, but it was not easy laughter. It was sharp and thin, like glass breaking. They mocked him, called him soft, but some felt their stomachs knot. German officers tried to kill the talk. They told their men not to believe enemy propaganda. They insisted the Americans were trapped like everyone else, that the only way home for them was a coffin. Political officers repeated slogans about the fatherland, about duty until final victory. But the words landed differently now. They sounded tired, and the prisoners' small details didn't fit the pattern of deliberate lies. The boy had described leave towns in France where soldiers could bathe and sleep in beds. He spoke of mail from home promising jobs waiting after the war. He mentioned parcels and furlough ships. He seemed too naive to invent such things. One evening, when the trench was quiet except for a few coughing fits and the slow drip of water into a bucket, someone recited the rumor aloud again. "They go home," he said flatly. "They fight, and then they go home." No one answered. Even those who rejected it could not escape the picture it painted. A soldier who had crossed Africa, Russia, and now sat in this blackened forest whispered to himself, "What if it's true?" There was danger in that thought. For years, the German army had survived on the idea of unbroken lines and unending will. You fought because everyone else was fighting, and because there was no other road but forward. To imagine that the enemy could step away, heal, and be replaced by fresh men was to imagine an opponent playing a different game entirely, one with rules stacked in their favor. The rumor spread along trench networks like smoke. It slipped into dugouts, through whispered conversations over thin soup, through letters read and reread by lantern light. Some men dismissed it loudly, fearful of what it meant to believe. Others sat in silence, staring into the dark. If Americans truly rotated home, then time itself belonged to them. They could rest, recover, even see their families, while the Frontschwein rotted year after year in the same mud. The thought made men colder than the winter wind. And so, without a single shell fired, without any propaganda leaflet dropped from a plane, the seed was planted. Doubt had entered the German trenches. Not just doubt about winning, but doubt about the fairness of the fight itself. It clung to them, unseen but heavy, as they tightened their belts, lit damp cigarettes, and prepared for another night that had no end date. Somewhere beyond the trees and wire, the war was organized in ways the German infantry could hardly imagine. In the American Army, service at the front was not meant to stretch into years of unbroken exhaustion. It was a segment of a larger plan, a system with boundaries and relief valves. Men were moved like carefully counted pieces, deployed, fought, withdrawn, healed, and sometimes sent across the sea to start over. The system had been built deliberately, long before any rifle cracked in the Hürtgen forest. Its quiet existence gave shape to the rumor that had unsettled the trenches. Behind the American lines were places the Germans would never see except in whispered accounts from prisoners, rest camps tucked into quiet French villages or country estates requisitioned for war. They had names that sounded almost gentle: leave centers, recreation depots, staging areas. Soldiers, they were not digging frozen foxholes or watching the tree for movement. They were washing, sleeping on real mattresses, eating food that came on plates rather than from tins. There were small luxuries: music from radios, coffee poured hot and sweet, Red Cross stations where clean socks and new boots could be drawn without argument. Some camps had gardens kept neat even in war, libraries where books waited in English and French, cinemas showing films sent from home. It was an alternate universe built just beyond the roar of the guns. For those who had been long in combat but still fit to return, there were R&R passes, short for rest and recuperation, a name too light for the weight it carried. An infantryman could find himself on a truck headed not to another doomed forest, but to Paris, newly liberated and glowing with electric light. For 3 or 5 days he might walk streets lined with cafes, sit under awnings while rain pattered harmlessly on cobblestones, and drink wine that had no taste of mud or fear. Others were routed to London, where music spilled from clubs and English families invited strangers for tea. The shift was jarring but planned, a deliberate way to remind men that the world still contained warmth and normalcy. Even deeper within the American command system was a larger promise, one whispered by prisoners and confirmed by captured papers: the point system. Officially called the Adjusted Service Rating Score, it turned months of service, battles fought, and wounds endured into arithmetic. Each soldier carried a tally: 1 point for each month in uniform, 1 for each month overseas, more for combat decorations, more if he had dependents waiting at home. When the number reached the threshold set by Washington, a man could go back, home, across the Atlantic to cities untouched by war, to wives and children and jobs saved for him. It was not just a policy. It was a guarantee of an ending. To make such a system work required a machine beyond anything Germany possessed by late 1944. America trained replacement divisions continuously on home soil, shipping new men across oceans in a steady stream. Transport ships moved with assembly line predictability, bringing fresh battalions while carrying back the exhausted. Hospitals stretched from field tents to vast complexes in England and the United States. Aircraft ferried the gravely wounded. Hospital ships sailed with white hulls and green crosses lit at night. No soldier was meant to disappear into the mud forever. Someone, somewhere, was counting his days. The effect on those who served was profound. A man could face horror knowing it was not endless. The possibility of rotation steadied nerves and kept units from dissolving under strain. An American platoon might lose men to wounds or exhaustion, but those who survived knew relief could come. They wrote about it in letters home. "If I get my points, maybe by Christmas. London next week for a pass. They say I've earned it." Even without full return, the cycle of rest meant the front was not a life sentence. By contrast, the German system had no such calculus. Once a man was sent forward, only death, crippling injury, or total collapse could remove him. Leave was rare and mostly symbolic. A few days snatched if transport and approval aligned, which it seldom did in 1944. There was no promise to balance sacrifice, no ledger where months of misery became a ticket out. German planners had never imagined a war this long. They had built no machinery to care for the worn out. It was easy for Americans to seem tireless when they could replace men before they broke completely. And that was what unsettled the German line more than any single battle. The realization that across the fog and shell bursts, an enemy had found a way to fight hard while preserving its soldiers' will. The system was invisible from a dugout, but devastating once understood. A war waged with logistics not just for weapons, but for human endurance. For the Germans hearing of it secondhand, The knowledge seeped in slowly. They pictured trucks ferrying men away to warm barracks and clean beds, trains carrying them to ports, ships steaming westward under guard. They imagined homes waiting, fresh uniforms folded in depots, whole armies renewed while they themselves grew thinner and slower with each season. It was not propaganda. It was structure, and it was working. And in the frozen dark of the Hürtgen, that quiet, efficient promise across the lines cut deeper than shrapnel. The first letters arrived in damp canvas sacks taken from a knocked-out American supply truck. Intelligence officers slit them open carefully, expecting maps or passwords or codes hidden in casual phrases. Instead, what spilled out was something more dangerous than secrets, ordinary life untouched and waiting. There were birthday cards pressed flat between ration sheets, photographs of girls in summer dresses, snapshots of babies born while fathers fought in Europe. And there were lines, simple, cheerful lines, that no one on the German side could quite believe. A corporal in the Wehrmacht censorship section sat in a dim stone room, reading one after another by lantern light. Back to England next week for rest, one American wrote. Another told his sister not to worry, that he might get rotation orders soon and would be home to plant spring corn. One described a pass to Paris, a meal in a cafe with real bread and butter, and a plan to buy a ring before going back to Kansas to marry his sweetheart. The words were so casual, they seemed almost cruel. This was not the voice of a man chained to front until death. This was a man keeping count, trusting a machine behind him to honor the count. The officers tried to smother what they found. Reports went upward stampgeheim, filed under psychological warfare risk. Only a handful of vetted men were supposed to read the contents. But armies are porous. Paper leaks like water. A sergeant assigned to burn the excess copies slipped one into his coat. In the next dugout over, a friend read it by candle flame and passed it along. Soon the Frenchwomen were whispering about letters filled with strange promises, a system that tallied a soldier's suffering and sent him home whole. Some of the mail was intercepted at field posts close to the line, and guards tasked with sorting couldn't help but notice the tone. The Americans wrote not with a hollow resignation of men trapped, but with an impatient expectancy, as if the war were a hard job with an end date. Got my points up to 73. One wrote, need 85 to ship home. Another said he was due new boots and a leave pass soon. He told his wife to keep the car running. To German ears, even the phrase car running felt alien. Petrol at home was gone. Whole cities were rubble. The idea of returning to a driveway and starting an engine after a few months at war was absurd. And yet here it was in black ink. Commanders warned their troops that these letters were planted fakes, part of some Allied plot to break morale. Official bulletins called them perfied feigned propaganda. But the handwriting was too ordinary, the details too small and believable. The name of a dog waiting on a porch in Indiana, a note about harvest weather back home, a mother's recipe tucked between pages. There were photographs showing men smiling with their arms slung around each other in clean uniforms, somewhere far from the front. None of it looked manufactured. The dissonance gnawed at men already stretched thin. A veteran who had fought in Stalingrad turned a letter over in his hands and muttered that Americans must live in a different universe. A younger soldier asked quietly if maybe the war was easier when you knew you'd see home again. His squad leader barked at him to shut up, but his eyes stayed fixed on the page. In places where morale was already brittle, the letters were a quiet acid, eating at the brittle crust of endurance. Back in Berlin, officers debated whether to show more or less of the captured mail. Some argued for exposure, claiming it would steel German will through anger. Others insisted it would only sow despair. In the end, most of the bundles vanished into locked cabinets, but enough pages slipped out to do their work. Soldiers at the front are expert scavengers. They find what matters. Night after night, in bunkers that smelled of damp wool and gun oil, the stories recirculated. Someone would repeat a phrase half remembered. Going home for harvest, wedding in Kansas, new boots, leave pass. Each time the details grew sharper, not weaker. A man could imagine the train rides, the ships, the kitchens where wives waited. And then he would glance around at the mud walls, the dwindling rations, the faces gray with fatigue. Whatever the officers said, The gap between worlds was obvious. It was a slow unraveling, not a shout, but a whisper carried along trench lines. The idea that somewhere across no man's land an army existed that not only fed its men, but counted their days and promised them back to life, in an exhausted force already doubting its cause. The intercepted letters did more than any shell to hollow belief. They hinted at an enemy who could wage total war without destroying its own sons, and at a home that might no longer exist for those still trapped in the forest. The first man to speak was gone from travel but alive, which in itself felt like a small miracle. He had been taken into chaos after Aachen fell, pulled from a shattered foxhole and marched west. Months later he returned across the lines in a prisoner exchange, an unusual arrangement brokered for badly wounded men. His comrades gathered in a half-collapsed barn, not sure what to expect. He looked different, not healthier exactly, but clean-shaven, his tunic patched with unfamiliar thread, his eyes alert rather than vacant. When someone asked what it had been like, he hesitated, as if searching for a safe way to answer. Then, softly, he said the Americans were nothing like the rumors. He told them about the camp first, because that was easy to describe. Wooden barracks with stoves, steady food, doctors who treated wounds without cruelty. That alone was enough to draw quiet gasps. Then came the detail that made the air change. He said the guards had spoken openly of their own tours. One had been in Italy and was now back in France, assigned to rear duty because his time was done. Another was counting points. Soon to ship home. Home, the man repeated, letting the word hang. The room stayed still. After years without the idea of return, home sounded fragile, almost dangerous to say aloud. At first they assumed he had misunderstood, but he swore the system was real. He had seen the guards' discharge papers. The Americans measured service like something you could spend and finish. When a man had done enough, he left. If he was wounded, he went behind the lines to recover, not patched up and shoved back forward. Some returned to the fight, but many didn't. They rotate, the former prisoner said. They count the days. His voice carried a strange mix of awe and bitterness. Others trickled back in similar trades and swaps. Stretcher cases exchanged through Switzerland. Men too broken to be of use to either army. They told variations of the same story. Camps where meat and bread arrived in regular wagons. Red Cross parcels with chocolate and cigarettes. Guards who talked about leave in Paris. About wives writing to say the crops needed harvesting, but soon the husband would be there to help. For German soldiers who had not seen home since 1941, the words were a blow. They had been taught to picture enemy life as desperate and thin. Instead, they were hearing about an enemy that could pause its war to preserve its fighters. Officers tried to stamp it out. Interrogators debriefed the returnees in private, warning them not to repeat enemy propaganda. Political functionaries declared the tales exaggerated or fabricated, meant to soften the Wehrmacht. But the men who had lived it were not good liars. They had no reason to invent comfort. They spoke plainly, even wearily, about what they had seen. Some broke down as they talked, ashamed at their own relief, ashamed of how envy crept in alongside the humiliation of capture. In trenches and bunkers, these accounts spread like water finding cracks. The Americans go home, someone would whisper, almost in disbelief. They fight and then they go home. It wasn't shouted. It was passed carefully, because hope was dangerous here. But once the idea landed, it lingered. Soldiers stared into the misty tree-line and tried to picture an end beyond collapse or death. Some remembered wives and farms. Children now grown taller than the memory they carried. Others, hardened by years, scoffed outwardly but felt something shift deep inside. The impact wasn't just on the rank and file. Junior officers, themselves exhausted, found the stories impossible to ignore. They saw their companies crumble from attrition and sickness. They understood what endless front duty did to a man. To hear that the enemy had engineered a way to fight while preserving morale and strength was quietly devastating. War, they realized, was not only about courage. It was about systems. The returnees also described something subtler than rations and schedules, an attitude. American guards joked, sang, traded cigarettes. They talked to plans beyond the war. not because they were naive, but because their army allowed them to think of after. That mindset was foreign to men who had been taught that the Reich consumed everything and gave nothing back. To serve Germany was to disappear until the war ended, or you did. In muddy shelters that winter, a new kind of silence settled after such talk. It was not the silence of discipline, but of recognition. These men had fought across continents on the promise of honor and final victory. Now they face an adversary powerful enough to treat its own as valuable, to send them away alive and bring in fresh blood without breaking stride. For the first time, some began to feel not just tired, but outmatched in a deeper way. Defeated not by one battle, but by a philosophy of war they could not hope to copy. The forest still shook with artillery. Orders still came to hold at all costs. Yet somewhere beneath the noise, something had cracked. When prisoners returned bearing stories of ships carrying soldiers home mid-conflict, of cities welcoming them back, of armies that measured a man's worth beyond the trenches, it touched a wound no propaganda could heal. And from that wound, quiet despair began to seep into the ranks, invisible but unstoppable. It crept in slowly, not with a cry but with a small, private thoughts men rarely dared to voice. For years the German soldier had been told that the only way through was endurance, that there was no path home except victory or death. To fight for the Reich meant surrendering time itself. The army did not keep count of days or wounds. If a man was still breathing and could hold a rifle, he belonged at the line. Even those who were pulled away bleeding sometimes returned after a patch of convalescence, sent back before their hands stopped shaking. The machine could not afford to lose bodies. Now another truth, whispered and doubted but never fully denied, began to gnaw at the edges of that grim certainty. The Americans, it seemed, fought fiercely but did not treat their soldiers as expendable. They bled them hard but pulled them back before they shattered. They built systems that recognized fatigue as a real threat, that measured service in numbers and promised reprieve. And once that possibility became known, once letters and prisoners and captured orders confirmed it, the effect was like a hairline crack in frozen ground. Silent at first, then spreading. In dugouts reeking of damp wool and human closeness, men started to compare fates. Someone would mutter that a GI with the same wounds would be on a ship by now. Another would answer with a flat joke about how the Reich would strap a rifle to a corpse if it could. They laughed because laughter was safer than envy, but the laughter carried no warmth. It was a brittle kind that breaks off quickly and leaves a heavy quiet behind. The crack widened every time replacements arrived. The newcomers were not fresh and rested. They were thin-limbed boys snatched from training too soon, or middle-aged men from the Volkssturm, faces still pale from factory floors. They came with no illusion of rotation, only the quiet dread of a one-way road. Meanwhile, stories of American replacements moved to the grapevine. Endless reserves poured from a well that did not seem to run dry. For each broken man the U.S. sent home, another stood ready to step into his place. Boots dry, rifle clean, nerves not yet frayed. Germany had no such reservoir. Every loss thinned the line. Sleep became dangerous. Men woke from dreams of home and felt the weight of futility settle heavier than their gear. They were not cowards. Many had survived years of unthinkable hardship. But hope, once awakened, is a powerful thing. Knowing there was another way to wage war, a way that preserved life, turned their own situation from harsh but bearable to almost intolerable. It was not just the body that tired. It was the spirit. Officers saw it in small acts. Slower salutes, unshaven faces, more cigarettes burned down to the end. Field reports spoke of increased defeatism, a phrase that tried to cage something rawer and more human. They tried to counter it with lectures and slogans. Victory or death was painted on dugout walls. Leaflets promised that final weapons would turn the tide. But each time a man learned of another American going home alive, the paint and the slogans thinned like frost in sunlight. The contrast went beyond logistics. It was philosophical. The Americans seemed to believe a soldier was worth keeping whole if possible. They fought no less hard. No one doubted their ferocity when the artillery came or the Shermans pushed forward, but underneath was a recognition that men were not infinite. That knowledge became a weapon sharper than any shell. It told the German infantryman he was not just fighting a better supplied army, but a better cared for one. It said plainly, the enemy can fight forever because he does not burn out his own strength. By winter's deep freeze, the psychological crack had widened into something officers could not plaster over. Surrender rates crept upward, small at first, then measurable. Men went missing on patrol and later appeared in Allied cages, alive and oddly relieved. Others stayed but seemed hollowed, doing only what orders required, and no more. Even those who refused to give up felt a shift, a numbness where once there had been grim pride. The forest and the war dragged on, but the silent ledger had changed. German soldiers could no longer pretend the fight was equal. On one side stood an army feeding men into endless attrition. On the other, an enemy whose system bent but did not break its own. In that realization lay the slow, quiet breaking of spirit, not a collapse that made headlines, but a seep of resignation that spread trench by trench, heart by heart, until even the hardest veterans felt it. This was no longer a struggle of courage alone. It was a contest of care and time was not theirs. It was easy, in the misery of the Hürtgen or the crumbling Siegfried Line, to believe the Americans had simply willed some magic system into existence. But the truth behind their rotation rested on something colder and more immense. Industry. Across the Atlantic, a machine had been built that dwarfed anything Europe had ever seen. Even before the United States entered the war, planners in Washington and generals at the War Department had mapped out how to sustain millions of men far from home, not just in weapons and food, but in the very rhythm of their lives. They understood that armies wore out faster than rifles, and that victory would require replacing human exhaustion as much as spent ammunition. Factories in places most German soldiers had never heard of, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, San Diego, were running day and night, pouring out trucks, boots, uniforms, radios, and weapons. Those same plants could also outfit a man who had just been pulled from the front and send another in his place without pausing production. It wasn't only about firepower. It was about continuity. While the Wehrmacht scraped for recruits and diverted teenagers from schoolrooms, America kept a reservoir of trained divisions waiting. Camp Blanding in Florida, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Fort Benning in Georgia, names meaningless to men freezing in Belgium, were in fact sprawling cities of instruction. Their young men drilled, learned to shoot, march, and survive. They ate well, grew stronger, and waited to be shipped out as replacements. Some would never arrive before the war ended, but their existence gave Washington freedom. Freedom to pull home the exhausted, to rotate the wounded and battle-worn. Shipping made the whole vision possible. From East Coast ports, Liberty and Victory ships moved with mechanical reliability. They were built fast, some in less than 6 weeks, and launched in flocks so large they turned harbors into forests of masts and funnels. Each ship could carry an entire regiment's worth of men and gear across the Atlantic in relative safety by late 1944, escorted by destroyers and guarded by air patrols. The same lanes that brought food and tanks could just as easily bring men back the other way. To the Germans, sea power had once been a distant concept. Now it was a hidden river feeding the enemy's strength. They could not cut those routes. Their U-boats had been beaten back, their surface fleet shattered. The sea belonged to the Allies, and so the flow of replacements and returning veterans never truly stopped. Behind the numbers was a mindset that had been forming for decades. War as a production problem. Henry Ford's assembly lines had taught Americans to scale up anything, whether it was sedans or bombers. Now that same logic applied to people. Training, transport, supply, medical care, all were treated as solvable engineering tasks. When a man's nerves frayed, there was a hospital for him. When his year of combat ended, there was a ship to take him away and another man to fill the gap. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, had been built for fast, decisive wars. Its supply system assumed victory would come before exhaustion mattered. Once the lightning campaigns failed and the front stretched for years, Germany had nothing comparable to the deep American bench. Factories were bombed, rail lines broken, fuel scarce. What new divisions existed were divisions in name only, hastily gathered men with poor training and no promise of relief. This imbalance was invisible until it wasn't. The first hints came when German troops faced fresh-faced Americans who looked impossibly healthy compared to their own gaunt comrades. These were not veterans of endless trench seasons. They were well-fed, sharp-eyed, and eager. The knowledge that someone back home had trained and shipped them specifically to replace the tired, gnawed-at morale. Even more haunting was the thought that somewhere a man they had faced months earlier might now be plowing field in Iowa or walking Main Street under summer skies. It wasn't just that America could rotate. It was that rotation cost them nothing in momentum. Divisions withdrawn for rest were backfilled without a pause in offensives. German intelligence tried to count ships and divisions, but could not keep pace. Their own rail system, strangled by bombing and shortages, could barely move supplies, let alone cycle armies. Each soldier on the ground felt that imbalance without needing a report. Their side grew thinner and slower. The enemy never seemed to. The physical reality of American might turned rumor into certainty. Food convoys arrived behind the lines with clockwork precision. New trucks, new boots, new weapons came endlessly. The same system that kept frontline Americans supplied also gave them the gift no German soldier expected: an end date to suffering. Industrial abundance became psychological weaponry. An army that can afford to send men home alive is an army that expects to win comfortably. For those stuck in sodden dugouts, this realization was crushing. They had been told willpower could bridge any gap, that courage and discipline could offset material disadvantage. But here was an enemy who not only outproduced them in shells and planes, but in human resilience. Every German soldier who grasped this felt something shift. The fight was no longer man against man. It was a weary body against a continent of factories and ships. And somewhere deep inside, where hope had been a fragile ember, the knowledge settled. You cannot outlast a nation that can build both weapons and rest. Beyond the gray, wet forests and broken villages where the fighting dragged on without pause, there existed another world. A world the Germans at the front only knew through fragments of rumor, and the odd descriptions smuggled back by prisoners or gleaned from intercepted notes. It was hard to picture from the freezing mud, but somewhere behind the American lines were places built not for battle, but for breathing. They called them rest centers, leave towns, recreation depots. Words that sounded almost luxurious to ears accustomed to endless duty. The Americans had carved out safe zones in liberated France, Belgium, and even part of England, turning quiet market squares and country estates into havens where soldiers could remember what it was to be human. Those who reached them after months in the line spoke with disbelief about long, hot showers that steamed away weeks of filth, about stacks of fresh towels and bars of soap with unfamiliar scents. They described Red Cross huts painted bright and welcoming, with nurses who smiled and handed out coffee as if the war were far away. Men were issued clean uniforms, sometimes entirely new from boots to cap, and for a moment the endless grind of the front receded. Meals became something more than rations. There were steak dinners served on real plates, not tins, bread soft and white, eggs cooked to order. Some places offered beer or wine and always coffee, strong, hot, bottomless. At night, music filled the halls. Swing tunes piped through radios or played by small jazz bands pulled together from soldiers on light duty. Dances were organized when local civilians could be persuaded to join. Laughter floated over candlelit tables. It was not luxury by peacetime standards, but after months of mud and fear, it felt almost unreal. The Red Cross presence deepened the effect. Its volunteers, women mostly, many young, some middle-aged mothers with determined eyes, created islands of normalcy. They wrote letters for men too exhausted to hold a pen, handed out candy and cigarettes, offered books and magazines. Simple things: a game of cards, a checkers set, a gramophone playing records from home. They asked about families, listened when men spoke haltingly about battle or about nothing at all. The message was subtle but unmistakable. You are not forgotten. You are worth caring for. From across the lines, the notion of such places felt like a fairy tale. German soldiers imagined it the way a starving man imagines a feast. In their own experience, rest meant perhaps a few days in a half-ruined village still within range of enemy artillery, sleeping in barns and scrounging for food. Leave was rare, choked by collapsing rail networks and shortages. The idea of entire towns dedicated to recovery, while the war still raged, seemed impossible. Yet details kept coming. A prisoner told of Paris leave, soldiers strolling the boulevards, buying postcards, eating in cafes. Another described English country houses turned into convalescent centers with gardens and nurses. An intercepted American letter mentioned a pass to the Riviera, sun and sea before returning to duty. Even if embellished, the core truth was plain enough. The enemy built spaces where men could step out of the slaughter and return still whole. In the damp dugouts, this image hurt more than any propaganda. Soldiers pictured warm water running over a body that had not known warmth for months. They imagined lying in a real bed, shoes off, lungs filled with air that didn't stink of cordite. Some allowed themselves a moment of fantasy. A cigarette that wasn't stale, a plate of food without ration scraps, music that wasn't drowned by artillery. Then the cold seeped back in, and they glanced at each other, ashamed to have wanted what was never coming. The psychological gap widened. If an army could afford such respite, what else could it afford? New boots? New divisions? Endless patience? And if a soldier could fight knowing that after enough time someone would send him back to light and laughter, how could you match that resolve with only the hope of surviving another day? Commanders tried to crush the talk. They said these leave centers were a myth or a bribe to make Americans fight a soft war. They sneered that it proved Allied weakness. But the men at the front had seen enough to know better. They faced Americans who were not weak, who fought hard and well supplied, whose morale held under fire. If anything, the existence of those safe zones explained it. A man given reason to believe he matters fights differently than one told only to endure until he breaks. And so, while shells still cracked overhead and boots sank deeper into cold mud, the vision of those rest centers persisted. Bright fragments of another kind of war. Cigarettes lit by warm hands. Steak and coffee. Jazz and laughter drifting across polished floors while guns thunder miles away. For the exhausted German infantry, it was almost worse than the enemy's artillery. The knowledge that across the line men fought fiercely, but someone had built them a road back to life. They came bundled in twine, paper worn soft from too many hands. Mail from home, longed for, feared, and often opened with trembling fingers in the damp corners of dugouts. Each letter carried a piece of another life, but by late 1944 those lives were collapsing under the weight of a losing war. The envelopes no longer smelled faintly of perfume or hearth smoke. They smelled of desperation, of kitchens stripped bare and cities turned to rubble. A corporal from Bremen unfolded his mother's latest note under the thin glow of a candle stub. She wrote of air raids that shook their apartment every night, of running to basements while incendiaries fell like fiery rain. She told him his younger brother was gone to the Hitler Youth training camps, his father's factory flattened. And then, in a cramped postscript that blurred from damp fingers, "Hold fast, my son. Do not shame us by surrender. The Führer's victory is near." He folded the page slowly, his jaw tight, but the words "hold fast" seemed to echo as something hollow rather than strong. Another man passed around a letter from his wife. She wrote of hunger, of children thin with coughs, of trading heirloom china for potatoes. She asked only that he survive long enough to see them again, but without any promise that such a day could be arranged. There was no system to bring him home, no points or rotation, only an implied bargain. Fight on and perhaps fate will be kind. She closed with a plea born less of hope than fear. Do not fail us. There is no safe place here. Again and again the theme repeated. Mothers and wives begged for endurance because there was nothing else to ask. They had no language for reprieve. They had been told there would be none. The Reich fed them slogans, not certainty. Radio broadcasts shouted about final victory, miracle weapons, a last great blow to drive the Allies back. But the letters spoke a different truth. Blackouts, hunger, bombed streets, empty chairs at tables. Every new paragraph was another small weight dropped on the soldiers' backs. Some men read privately and said nothing. Others tried to keep faces neutral while passing news along. Hamburg in flames, rail lines shattered, fuel gone. Even those who had once believed felt cracks forming. They looked at the Americans across the wire and thought of the letters those men must be getting. Talk of harvests and weddings and ships waiting to bring them back. Their own mail offered no such end, only the desperate wish that they hold on long enough to be useful. One night, during a lull between barges, a young soldier from Cologne read aloud by accident, his voice carrying over the mud because he forgot to lower it. His sister wrote that their street was gone, their parents missing since the last bombing. and she didn't know where to bury anyone as she found them. She begged him to be strong for Germany, but the words quavered into grief. When he finished, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow crack of a cigarette passed hand to hand. Officers urged men to answer with pride, to reassure families that they would stand firm. Some tried. They wrote back with lies of stable fronts and unbroken spirits, trying to feed hope they themselves no longer felt. But many simply stopped writing more than a few lines. "I am alive. Pray for me." Anything more felt cruel. The absence of a promised return became the unspoken wound in every company. They could picture the Americans writing dates in calendars, counting points, telling mothers soon. Their own mothers could ask only that they keep fighting and not disgrace the family. Duty, honor, sacrifice, words worn thin by years of slaughter. Winter deepened. The letters kept coming, but lighter, fewer pages, ink smudged by cold hands and fear. Sometimes they didn't come at all. Entire postal routes were broken by bombing. Silence from home could mean anything: death, displacement, or simply no paper to send. And each lost line, each fading voice, made the front feel even further from the life it was supposed to defend. By the new year, those tattered envelopes had become more than personal grief. They were mirrors held up to a nation's exhaustion. The men read them and saw no plan, no machine behind them strong enough to bring them out of this forest. Only pleased to endure in the shadow of a future that felt less like homecoming and more like vanishing. It was a loneliness deeper than mud and frost. It was a knowledge that they belonged to a war that had no path back. When the guns fell silent long enough for the wounded to be gathered, the difference between armies revealed itself in ways as cutting as any weapon. On the American side, the sight of their casualties leaving the field was almost as organized as the arrival of replacements. Medics appeared quickly, crisp and deliberate, their Red Cross armbands stark against mud-stained sleeves. Stretcher teams moved with practiced efficiency, calling for morphine, bandages, plasma. Ambulances with white stars growled down rutted roads, their tires hissing through mud and snow, ferrying the broken to aid stations that were more than tents. They were the first links in a chain that stretched across an ocean. Those who survived the first hours found themselves moved rearward in a steady rhythm. Aid station to field hospital to evacuation hospital, then on to long trains that slid through the French countryside toward ports and waiting ships. Hospital ships gleamed white with green crosses, lit at night, so no submarine could claim a stake. Inside were clean sheets, nurses who spoke softly, doctors who worked not just to stabilize but to heal. Men who had been torn by shrapnel or burned in tank fires wrote letters home from these ships, their handwriting shaky but alive. For them, war was ending. They might not fight again, but they would live to see another country, another life. Some of those ships steamed all the way back to the United States. Soldiers stepped off at New York or Norfolk or San Francisco, met by military police and hospital corpsmen, then whisked to sprawling medical centers. Walter Reed, Brook, Valley Forge. Names unknown to Germans crouched in foxholes, but legendary to Americans who knew they were there. Months of care followed. Surgeries, new limbs, physical therapy, even training for other military jobs if they couldn't return to combat. Men learned trades, studied in rehab wards, or were reassigned to safer duties stateside. Some were sent back to their hometowns with honor and pensions, greeted by parades, families, and doctors who would keep treating them long after their uniforms were folded away. For German soldiers watching from the mud, this kind of recovery was unimaginable. Their wounded had a single road, a hurried dressing station near the line, if one still existed. Surgeons with dwindling supplies and no blood to give. Transport was uncertain. Horse carts or battered trucks jolted over frozen roads. Trains, if available, ran sporadically and often under air attack. Hospitals in Reich overflowed, understaffed, stripped by years of blockade and bombing. Men arrived fevered and weak only to be patched crudely and, if they could still walk, return to the same front they'd left bleeding. There was no concept of permanent removal except for the most catastrophic injuries. Shell-shocked minds and mangled bodies alike were recycled, if at all possible. The Army could not spare them. Rumors of the American system filtered across with prisoners and intercepted correspondence. He lost his leg and they sent him home, One man whispered after questioning a captured GI. Another swore an American had told him a friend wounded twice, and then reassigned to training duty in Texas. To Germans ground down by years without reprieve, these stories felt almost treasonous to hope for, but they matched what they could see with their own eyes. Hospital ships in the Channel, steady convoys heading west, Americans who vanished from the line after serious wounds and were never seen again. The psychological cost of this contrast deepened with each offensive. A German rifleman could be shot through the shoulder, evacuated a few kilometers, stitched crudely, and handed back a weapon within weeks. The pain, the fear, the exhaustion, none of it mattered. Meanwhile, the enemy who bled beside him might be on a ship headed home to warmth and safety. That knowledge hollowed resilience. Courage thrives when suffering seems meaningful. It withers when suffering seems one-sided. Officers tried to smother comparisons, insisting the Americans would run out of men, that their hospitals were a trick to lure more volunteers. But the war had gone on too long. Men were no longer naive. They watched fresh American troops arrive while their own ranks filled with older reservists and green boys. They saw how alive the enemy seemed, how quickly they returned or were replaced. Every time a litter bearer stepped past with a comrade groaning under bloody blankets, the questions returned. Would this man be dragged back to the same frozen trench in weeks? Almost certainly. Would an American in his place be crossing an ocean to a clean bed? Almost certainly. And if so, what did that say about the war they were fighting and the nation asking them to fight it? By the winter of 1944, the realization had sunk deep. The Americans treated their wounded as investments to be preserved. Germany treated its wounded as fuel to be burned until nothing remained. The Frontschwein might still fight bravely, but quiet truth had lodged in their bones. Courage alone cannot survive when every injury means another trip into the meat grinder, while across the lines even broken men were allowed to stop. It began as a subtle shift, hardly visible at first. Soldiers who once spoke only of holding the line grew quieter, their gazes longer, lingering on a horizon where they imagined ships, trains, and homes they would never see again. The stories of American rotation and care passed from man to man like contraband, shaping the silence between artillery bursts. At night in sodden bunkers, someone would murmur, "They go home," and no one would argue anymore. What had started as rumor had hardened into accepted truth. That acceptance changed everything. Diaries began to fill with words different from the early years. Where once there had been notes of pride or grim determination, hold until relieved, victory will come. Now there were entries written like confessions. One soldier from Würzburg wrote, simply, "We're sind Kettenhund. We are chained dogs." Another scribbled, "They fight, but they are not prisoners of their own army." The act of writing became a small act of rebellion. If the army would not count their days, they would. Tallies appeared in margins. Years since home, battle survived, comrades lost. But the lists led nowhere, because there was no finish line. Desertion had always existed, but by late 1944 it shifted in tone. It was no longer just a terrified conscript slipping away in first combat. Hardened veterans began to consider it too. The calculus changed. An enemy that promised its men a way back seemed to promise, indirectly, safety for those who surrendered. Captured Americans spoke of full rations, cigarettes, medical care. Prisoners who returned through exchanges confirmed it. And so, when positions were flanked or cut off, more Germans let themselves be taken alive instead of fighting to the last cartridge. Some no longer saw honor in dying for a command that would not value them as the enemy valued its own. Commanders felt and tried to counter with speeches about betrayal and shame. Field police units tightened their grip, patrolling with pistols drawn, ready to execute suspected deserters on the spot. Posters threatened death for defeatism. Propagandists painted Americans as cowards who needed comfort to fight. But the men at the front had seen enough to know those words rang hollow. They faced Americans who attacked relentlessly, well-fed and well-supplied. Soft was a lie. It only deepened resentment. Why call the enemy weak when their system let them survive? The cracks widened fastest in units forced to hold impossible positions. In the Ardennes counteroffensive, when initial success turned to retreat, whole groups drifted away under cover confusion. Some simply walked toward Allied lines when the shooting lulled, hands raised, praying for food and a bed more than anything ideological. Others melted back toward villages, tried to vanish before military police could catch them. Letters from home, heavy with despair, tipped the balance. A man could justify holding on for family when he imagined returning. He could not when a family wrote only of ruins and hunger. Morale decayed not with dramatic collapse, but with erosion. Men still obeyed orders, but less quickly, with less fire. Foxholes became places of waiting rather than fighting. Officers barked and were met with stares that did not hate, but no longer feared. The promise of Germany's invincibility had been bled out. Now the promise of care was gone too. What remained was survival, and survival often meant choosing captivity over death. Even those who did not desert were changed. They fought cautiously, unwilling to risk themselves for hopeless ground. Patrols returned sooner. Ambushes were abandoned if uncertain. Initiative withered. Diaries recorded it bluntly. No one believes in final victory. We hold until shells or cold take us. Some began carrying white cloth tucked inside tunics, just in case. The psychological wound was self-inflicted, though unseen by those who designed the war. By chaining men to the front with no exit, Germany had once created a ferocity born of having nothing to lose. But as soon as the enemy revealed a different way, a war where endurance was honored and relief possible, that ferocity turned to bitterness. Courage without hope curdled fast. When spring came and the Reich collapsed town by town, the surrender of whole formations surprised only the leadership. The soldiers themselves were long finished. They had endured too many winters, buried too many friends, and read too many letters full of empty promises. Across the line, men their age were going home alive, while they were asked to die in forests already lost. Faced with that truth, more and more chose to live, even if it meant turning their backs on a cause that once seemed unbreakable. In staff dugouts lit by guttering lamps, German officers pored over binders and field manuals taken from captured American units. The volumes were not glamorous. Charts, flow diagrams, maintenance schedules. But to men trained in the gospel of speed and shock, they read like dispatches from another kind of war. Here was no poetry about destiny or blood. Here was planning so deep it felt alien. Tables for food distribution, rest cycles calculated to the day, medical evacuation mapped as carefully as tank assaults. It was war treated as an engineering problem. Some of the younger staff officers found themselves unsettled by the clarity. One manual broke down a division's health as if it were a machine. How many days of continuous combat before performance degraded? What percentage of casualties required full evacuation? How many replacements per week kept morale stable? Alongside the numbers were instructions for recreation, music, reading, hot meals after operations. Another binder laid out rail timetables, so precise they read like factory schedules. Even truck maintenance was codified. Every tire, every spark plug counted and tracked. These details, dry and almost boring, contained the secret of endurance. The contrast to their own way of war was painful. German doctrine had prized initiative and aggression, the speed of decision, the willingness to push beyond planned limits. That approach had brought early triumphs, but also exhaustion. Logistics had been a means to an end, improvisation a virtue. Yet here was an enemy that treated the invisible threads, food, rest, replacement, not as afterthoughts, but as a very skeleton of its strength. And because of that, the Americans could be relentless without burning themselves hollow. Senior officers muttered about soulless warfare, about accountants running an army. But those who had watched their divisions erode into skeletal units could not dismiss what they saw. The Americans rotated entire regiments off the line before collapse. They fed them properly, clothed them warmly, replaced their boots and rifles before both fell apart. They charted the mental toll of battle as surely as the physical. Their manuals spoke openly of combat exhaustion and prescribed rest and treatment instead of shame. German medicine still labeled the same condition cowardice. Reports filtered upward from interrogation of prisoners who spoke with quiet confidence about the system that held them. An American lieutenant captured near the Moselle explained his division had a set number of days in combat before being relieved. His job, he said, was to keep his men effective, not to grind them down. The interrogator scoffed outwardly but took notes. Others described the point system with matter-of-fact faith, as though rotation home was a natural law, not a gift. Even supply clerks seemed sure someone would count and care. For officers taught that willpower could overcome material weakness, this was an uncomfortable revelation. They had spent years believing that morale came from ideology and iron discipline. But these manuals showed another source: trust. A soldier who knows he will be withdrawn before breaking, who knows his wounds will be treated and his suffering measured, fights differently. He fights knowing his life matters beyond the day's orders. Some tried to adapt, scribbling ideas in margins about rotating battalions or creating local rest billets. But it was too late. Germany lacked the reserves and transport to imitate what required oceans of shipping and untouched industry. Trains were bombed, fuel was scarce, replacements thin. The intellectual recognition could not conjure resources. Still, the understanding cut deep. They were losing not because their men lacked courage, but because the enemy had built a smarter war. This realization seeped into the officer corps with a quiet, demoralizing honesty. It showed up in after-action notes. Troops physically spent. Morale collapses after continuous exposure. No relief possible. They saw the enemy solving those same problems with machine-like regularity. An American corps might fight for weeks, then disappear behind lines, reappearing months later rebuilt and dangerous again. German divisions staggered on until they ceased to exist. By the last winter, even proud veterans admitted the gap. Over schnapps sipped in cold cellars, they told each other what they could not say in reports. They fight with brains as well as guns. We have courage, they have system. Courage was still there, but now it felt like a candle burning down in an endless night. On the other side of the wire was an army that kept its candles trimmed and replaced, one after another, so the light never failed. And in that understanding lay a quiet, weary respect and a deeper despair. The war was not just lost in the field. It was lost in the ledgers and schedules long before the last battle began. By the last winter of the war, the slogans painted on dugout walls had begun to feel like jokes told too many times. Sieg oder Tod, victory or death, had once sounded fierce, carved into the imagination of a nation that believed it could shape the world through will alone. Now it hung like a bad echo over men who had lived too many frozen nights, watched too many comrades buried in shallow, snow-filled trenches. The orders still came, but the certainty behind them had drained away. In the beginning, endless endurance had been a point of pride. Soldiers were told they belonged to a people tougher than any other, able to survive cold, hunger, and defeat before turning each setback into revenge. Hitler's speeches promised that grit and sacrifice could bend fate. Fight to the last man was supposed to mean strength without limit. But strength had limits after all. They had seen divisions starved into ruin on the Eastern Front, regiments broken and patched and broken again until nothing remained but numbers on a staff map. They themselves had been carried from Russia to Italy to France and back, year after year, always forward until there was nowhere left to go but back toward their own borders. Into that fatigue seeped the enemy's quieter promise. The idea, confirmed now by too many sources to dismiss, that across the lines of war was fought differently. American soldiers, no less brave and often terrifying in battle, lived with the knowledge that their time at the edge of death could end. They counted down service points like prisoners, marking the days to release, but release that was real and granted by their own command. They could imagine going home alive. They could imagine stepping off a ship into sunlight that wasn't filled with smoke. For the German infantrymen, that contrast worked like acid on old certainties. To be chained forever, to know there was no system watching the toll, no intention to save you, was one thing when you believed the other side suffered just as much. But to fight on while your opponent managed relief, rest, and return, this turned sacrifice into futility. Courage became a one-sided currency spent into emptiness. It showed in the way men spoke to each other. Early war letters had brimmed with iron resolve. Now the ones that left the trenches, when mail still moved, were thin and cautious. We do what we can. I am alive. Few claim belief in the final victory. Around fires too small to warm frozen hands, older sergeants stopped retelling the old tales of Stalingrad endurance. They looked at the young ones and said only, "Survive if you can." Some didn't bother to pretend anymore, whispering that Berlin would fall, and that maybe it was better if it ended soon. Fear remained, but it had changed. It was no longer the raw terror of shells and tanks. It was a heavy hopelessness, a knowing that the future had narrowed to two doors, death here or captivity across the line. And captivity, once considered shameful, now seemed the only door that led somewhere human. They had heard too many accounts to doubt that the enemy would feed them, treat wounds, let them live. In contrast, their own command demanded an end without mercy. Hitler still thundered from radios about holding ground and miracle weapons, but even loyal listeners heard strain in his voice. The reality around them, the shortages, the constant retreat, the fresh American faces replacing each fallen one, mocked the speeches, where once his defiance had steeled hearts. Now it felt like a distant man screaming against tides already turned. The collapse of belief was quiet but total. Men still fired rifles and man guns because habits run deep and because fear of immediate punishment was real. But deep down, the story was gone. They no longer imagined a triumphant return through Berlin gates. They no longer pictured victory parades or proud fathers welcoming heroes. Instead, the inner picture was of exhaustion without end, or else surrender and a chance to live. When final orders came to hold towns and rivers to the last man, some obeyed because they had no way out. Others ignored them, slipping away or raising hands when capture loomed. Entire companies dissolved not from sudden panic, but from long, slow erosion. An army cannot run forever on the fumes of ideology when it learns the enemy runs on care and calculation. That spring, as the Reich crumbled, the myth of inexhaustible German endurance died quietly among the very men once asked to embody it. They had endured past reason, and now endurance itself seemed pointless. Courage had not failed. Trust had. And with trust gone, the last man was no longer willing to die. The spring came late and cold, the kind of raw chill that gnawed the bones rather than cut the skin. In the industrial valleys west of the Rhine, entire German armies found themselves folding back into one shrinking space. The Ruhr, what had been the Reich's beating heart of coal and steel, became a cage. Bridges were gone, blasted by retreating engineers, or swept aside by Allied bombers. Roads were clogged with refugees and broken armor. Air cover belonged wholly to the enemy now. Fighters swept low each morning, hunting convoys like hawks. By April, the trap had closed so tight that whole divisions understood their fate before the word surrender was even spoken. It happened less like a grand decision and more like a slow slackening. One by one, battalions simply stopped trying to break out. Officers who had preached sacrifice now faced men too hollow to obey. White flags, bedsheets, shirts, anything pale, appeared on shattered factory walls and out of shell holes. Soldiers who fought across continents stood up from their foxholes and walked toward the American lines with hand high, rifles abandoned in ditches. Many no longer looked afraid. They looked finished. Among them, conversation carried a strange, subdued honesty. They envied what they believed awaited their captors' captors, those American troops still fighting but tethered to a promise. They know they'll go home, a Feldwebel from Dusseldorf said quietly to man limping beside him as they moved toward surrender points. The other nodded and adjusted the makeshift sling on his arm. No speeches about honor, no mention of Führer or fatherland, just the blunt fact of survival and the bitter taste of knowing how differently the war had treated its enemies. Interrogation points sprang up quickly under Allied control. Americans organized their prisoners with the same efficiency that fed their armies. Trucks rolled in with water, bread, cigarettes. Men too weak to stand were lifted gently onto stretchers. The contrast was overwhelming for soldiers who had been told they would face cruelty. Instead, they saw GIs chatting easily, some smiling, some grim but not vengeful. They were herded, tagged, and given food, real food, not the scraps of retreat. Hot coffee steamed in the April air. One man wept openly over a mug, not because he loved the enemy, but because for the first time in years someone had treated him as if his life still mattered. Among senior German officers, the collapse felt like an intellectual defeat as much as a military one. They had studied the enemy long enough to know the surrender wasn't just about bombs or tanks. It was about a war machine built to sustain its own fighters and starve theirs. They had scoffed once at American comforts, but here those comforts stood revealed as strength. An army that rotated men, healed them, and sent them home when spent to preserve morale. Where theirs had bled out, some tried to maintain dignity, reminding their men to keep formation as they marched into captivity. But even that broke down. Columns dissolved into tired knots of men smoking the cigarettes handed across by young Americans who couldn't have been more than 20. "When will you go home?" one German asked through halting English. The GI shrugged and grinned. "Soon, I think." The German smiled faintly and looked away, swallowing something too heavy for words. News of Hitler's failing health and the advance on Berlin trickled in with each new captured group. It landed softly, almost without reaction. The will that might once have burned at betrayal or collapse was gone. The only emotion that lingered strongly was envy. Envy of an enemy who had fought hard but refused to devour its own sons. They had dreamed once of invincibility through suffering. Now they saw invincibility belonged to those who refused to grind men into dust. As the Ruhr Pocket emptied, Allied prisoners processed thousands each day. Whole regiments walked out intact, flags folded under arms not as trophies but as burdens. In makeshift pens ringed with barbed wire, German soldiers sat smoking and staring at the sky, some talking softly about farms and families, some silent. They were not joyous, but there was relief so profound it looked like sorrow. One diary found later contained a single line scrawled in pencil. "We did not lose for lack of courage. We lost because we were left to break." When trains finally took them west, bound for holding camps, many gazed from the windows at green hills and blooming orchards, and the bitterness returned in quiet waves. These were lands they crossed and bled over, now behind them forever. But mingled with bitterness was a fragile sense of survival. They would live, and that knowledge, stripped of ideology, felt almost sacred after years of being treated as expendable. The Americans never bragged in those moments. They processed, fed, and moved the prisoners with brisk, professional calm. But every cigarette, every orderly column of trucks and medics was a quiet argument. A nation strong enough to care for its fighters had won. Among the captives, some understood it instantly. Others would only realize years later, when they tried to build lives out of the wreckage. But the seed had been planted in the ruins of the Ruhr. The war was not won merely by fighting harder. It was won by fighting in a way that refused to waste men until they turned to shadows and despair, and that, more than any weapon, had broken them. When the war was finally over and the men who had survived returned to the ruins of their homeland, silence hung heavier than the rubble. Cities lay flat, rail lines tangled and useless, families scattered or gone. Among the officers who had lived long enough to think again, there came a strange new duty, to study how it had all unraveled. They gathered in low, cold rooms in shattered barracks, writing reports no longer meant to flatter Berlin, but to make sense of what had happened. In those rooms, far from the noise of propaganda, something close to honesty emerged. They wrote about the weapons, of course, and the crushing weight of Allied production, the aircraft that never seemed to stop coming, the convoys that no submarine could halt. But again and again another subject rose to the surface, one they could hardly have imagined discussing in the glory days of 1940. The way the Americans had treated their soldiers. In their notebooks and debriefings, the phrase appeared in different forms: morale to preservation, rotation as force multiplier, human maintenance. Cold words for a quiet, devastating truth, an army that spares its men when it can fight longer and breaks the enemy sooner. Former staff officers admitted that they had never planned for the human cost of endless campaigns. The doctrine of total war assumed that a German soldier's value lay in his willingness to endure beyond reason. They had called that strength. In retrospect, it was a slow suicide. "We believed sacrifice itself could defeat industry," one colonel wrote bitterly. But sacrifice without relief turned to despair. Another, once a proud planner of early Blitz campaigns, confessed that the belief in infinite toughness had blinded them. They had gambled that victories would come so fast no system of care was needed. When that gamble failed, there was nothing left to hold the army together. By contrast, capture American manuals and prisoner interviews told a different story. The United States had built a war machine that not only fed and armed its troops, but deliberately kept them human. Officers who had interrogated Americans during the war now admitted how unprepared they were for what they learned. Tour lengths, rest centers, psychiatric care, steady mail and pay. Not luxuries, but tools of endurance. They broke our will not by pampering men. One post-war analysis read, but by making sure their men knew someone counted their suffering and would bring them home alive. In cafes rising from the rubble and military study groups convened under Allied oversight, this admission took on quiet weight. Germany's new officers, those helping rebuild a modest post-war defense, taught a different lesson to younger men. Never again assume will alone can outlast a system built to preserve life. They spoke without bitterness now, more with a grim respect. Tanks and planes had beaten them, yes, but so had letters home promising return. So had warm meals and a train ticket back to safety when a soldier had done enough. Veterans felt it personally. In memoirs they published years later, some wrote with envy so sharp it still bled decades on. They remembered the moment they realized an American wounded beside them would soon see his wife again, while they were patched and shoved back into the line. Others recalled the first time they heard of points and rotation and felt their spirit drain. It was then I understood we could not win, one wrote. Not because I feared death, but because my death meant nothing while there's men going home. The insight shaped more than military thought. It seeped into how a defeated nation tried to rebuild itself. Care for the citizen, protection from pointless sacrifice, the idea that strength meant preserving rather than spending people. These ideas took root quietly in society sick of ruin. Some of the same men who once enforced unending duty would later advocate for soldiers' rights, for limits on service, for systems to bring men home whole. Decades on, historians would mark the logistical and industrial gulf as decisive, but the soldiers who would have knew the truth had also been psychological. They had faced an enemy that understood war's hardest math. Break the enemy's will before you break your own. America had done it not only with firepower, but with a relentless, almost tender calculation. How long a man could fight before despair outweighed courage, and what to do before that point arrived. In the end, this lesson survived a Reich that refused to learn it. In every future conflict studied in German staff colleges, the conversation would return to rotation, rest, and morale as critical as armor and artillery. For the men who had sat in mud and watched their belief dissolve, it was a truth purchased dearly. An army that cares for its fighters may still bleed, but it does not hollow out from within. And when you face such an enemy, even the strongest myth of endurance can crumble long before the front does.